Hello, I am Enrique Quesada, and this is the Judy Lealen Mexico Center podcast from the Center for the United States and Mexico at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. In 2019, Mexico's Congress approved the creation of a National Guard, a gendarmerie-style police force proposed by the López Obrador administration. Originally created to combat organized crime, the National Guard was immediately deployed to Mexico's southern border. The National Guard was placed under the Department of Security and Civilian Protection, but recruitment and training of its members has been conducted by the Department of National Defense, commonly referred to as SEDENA. In practice, the National Guard appears to be under the control of SEDENA, along with Mexico's armed forces. And López Obrador has said he plans to propose a constitutional reform to make this change official. To learn more about the role of the National Guard in Mexico's public security strategy and the implications of having the National Guard under military control, I sat down with Richard Kilroy. Richard Kilroy is a non-resident scholar at the Center for the United States and Mexico and an associate professor of politics at Coastal Carolina University. He has written extensively on North American security, homeland security, and Latin America defense issues. Prior to entering academia, Kilroy spent 23 years on active duty military service in the U.S. Army as a military intelligence and Latin America foreign area officer. Here's my conversation with Richard Kilroy. Richard Kilroy, Associate Professor of Politics at Coastal Carolina University in South Carolina and non-resident scholar in the Baker Institute Center for the United States and Mexico. Thank you so much for being back on the podcast.
Oh, thank you, Enrique. It's a pleasure to be here and finally meet you face to face.
I know. Last time we talked on Zoom, so I'm happy to talk to you in person this time and to have you back. This time, though, we will talk about the National Guard and Mexico's public safety challenge, let's call it.
That it is.
I don't think it will be news to our audience. Mexico has been dealing with a massive insecurity problem for a while. Like each year, I think we say it's been the most violent year, and so we just keep saying that every year. And to deal with these challenges in public security, President López Obrador, when he came into office, he proposed a new hybrid military police body to combat organized crime. It's called the National Guard, and it was meant to be under civilian control, and it would replace the federal police that President Calderón instituted. But before we get into how the National Guard has worked in practice, can you tell us what its purpose was, kind of the rationale for creating this new police force, or I guess military/police force, kind of what the training of the members is supposed to be, and how it's different from previous efforts from other presidents? Because it is worth noting that previous presidents have instituted new policing bodies too. So how is this different from those efforts?
Sure. No, this is it's an interesting topic because it's one that I've been looking at for a number of years. My research has been on civil-military relations in Mexico. That's what I wrote my doctoral dissertation on at the University of Virginia a long time ago, and then I had the chance, obviously, to work with the Mexican military in Mexico City, attending their war college as an exchange student. So I've been following kind of the development of the different military organizations and structures in Mexico for some time. But this was unique in the sense that when AMLO did come in, the original goal was to, as you said, kind of demilitarize the response to public safety. As you mentioned, previous presidents, Vicente Fox did a number of reforms when he was in office. And then, of course, Peña Nieto came in after Calderón and made changes as well. But all of them seemed to follow kind of a similar model, which was to, at least say you're trying to demilitarize the response to public safety. But in essence, what we found with AMLO's particular approach is that it was actually an increased militarization of the problem. And so as a result of that, I think what we're seeing right now is over time we've kind of been a change in kind of more towards the remilitarization of AMLO's approach under the new what's called the Plan National Peace and Security that he developed in 2018. So I think the main difference that I've seen so far is that this is really the Guardia Nacional is really a new branch of the military. In essence, it just becomes another element under SEDENA, and that was the most recent change, was to take it out from what at one time was to be that civilian Secretariat of Security and Civilian Protection, which it was originally put under. Now it's pretty much fully under SEDENA. So it's really under the Army. And in essence, it's really just become another branch of the military as opposed to a separate organization. We call them stability police forces, kind of like a national police model or some of the others that, other countries like Spain's Guardia Civil, the Gendarmerie, which was proposed earlier by Fox and Calderon. And then in this case, you're now looking at an organization that is performing many of the same functions as the military and working with the military, and not what it was originally intended to be when Calderon stood it up 3 years ago when he came into office.
So, a lot of the members come from the military, right? There's some police forces that were in the federal police before that are part of it, but they are not. Most of them are not. Most of them come from the military. And in terms of the type of activities that I guess they were supposed to be engaged in, I guess combating organized crime, that's not happening. They've been involved in other types of activities. What are those? What are some of those?
Right. Well, that was the goal initially when AMLO came into office, was to have the Guardia Nacional focus on countering transnational organized crime, or we call it CTOC. And to go after the cartels and to pull the military out from that mission, which Calderon pushed them to in 2009. If you remember, he declared martial law in Ciudad Juarez. I was actually in Juarez in May of 2009 when the military went in and took over many of those public safety functions as well as the governance function in the city of Ciudad Juarez, since it had become technically the murder capital of the world at that time. So putting the military into that position elevated their visibility, more transparency. It also elevated them to more charges of corruption, of human rights violations, and the other things, which the military in Mexico historically has been shielded from because they are considered to be a very insular type organization and not as transparent or visible as the federal police and some of the others that are doing public safety roles and functions. So that was the original goal, but what we saw them early on being thrust into was other missions like border security. They started getting involved in migrant control, particularly the Central American migrants coming across the southern border and then also along the U.S. border in the north. And then they also supported many of the missions the military was doing under AMLO, building the new Felipe Ángeles Airport,
right.
Tren Maya, some of these infrastructure development programs. So one of the concerns was that, well, if they're not really confronting organized crime, what organization is? If the military is meant to do that, and now they're being pulled out, and Guardia Nacional is not doing it, I think the consensus, at least in Mexico, and from the interviews and some of the other research I've been doing, is it seems like the Guardia Nacional has just become more of a public relations campaign to help people feel safer, at least by having an increased presence in many areas of the country. And in that case, we've seen them grow from initially 60,000. I think they're over 100,000 right now, which is significant in terms of military organizations and structures, because the entire armed forces of Mexico, we think, is probably about 250,000 all told. So creating this new Guardia Civil really, again, it didn't accomplish, at least from the research I've done so far, it really hasn't accomplished the main goal which AMLO set out to do, which was to take on transnational organized crime. If anything, they've been told not to confront the cartels. And in many cases, again, you'll see them physically in Mexico of having a presence all over the country. But the impression I get from a lot of the people I've talked to in the interviews that I've done is that they still don't know exactly what the future of the Guardia Nacional is going to be, post-AMLO, for example.
Yeah. And when I've been to Mexico City, I see them all over the place. I'm not sure what they're doing exactly. So it's interesting, right, that this was their goal, their primary reason for being, and it hasn't really worked out that way. Another thing that I guess hasn't happened according to plan, or I guess how it was proposed, it was that it was supposed to be a body under civilian authority and a military one. And López Obrador had expressed the interest in proposing a constitutional reform to integrate the National Guard into the SEDENA, the Department of National Defense, who is in charge of Mexico's Army and Air Forces, right? So basically just become, as you said, another branch of the military. What is the kind of the implications, the significance of this change, or I guess from what was proposed to what is actually happening?
Right. And funny, when you mentioned about your perception of the Guardia Nacional when you go back to Mexico, I raised this when I gave the talk last week on this topic, that a lot of people in this country remember after 9/11, people were afraid to fly. They didn't want to go into airports. They didn't want to get back on planes and fly. And so we actually put our National Guard, which is different from Mexico's. Our National Guard are state military organizations working for governors. But we put those in airports to basically make people feel safer. They were armed. They were in uniform. They had weapons. But a lot of people don't realize that they didn't give them actual bullets in the weapons. So it was more, again, it was more like providing public safety by giving them people a perception of feeling safer and a willingness to want to travel again. I kind of see that with the National Guard today with Mexico. It's the same thing. It's trying to give people a perception of safety. And the fact that some of the public opinion polling reinforces that. I saw some numbers from El Financiero and INEGI and some of the other polling organizations that say the approval rate is up like 80%. Among the Mexican public about the Guardia Nacional. And I saw testimony by the current director of the SPCC on that, and said, the people have she said the people have confidence in the National Guard. The question is, what is that confidence in terms of what are they really supposed to be doing? Right. Maybe the confidence is that they're seen to be more professional, or at least maybe less corrupt than the federal police were, or some of the previous attempts by the military to tackle organized crime. But I think you're right in the sense that there's a lot of concern about what the broader implications are going forward. My interviews with NGOs and some academics in Mexico and others are very concerned about the future of civil-military relations, and that's kind of the broader topic. Is this just an indicator of increased militarization throughout the country, of not just taking on organized crime, but just as we've seen, infrastructure development, putting the military into more and more public roles and being dependent on the military to do those, because there's a perception the military gets things done, or at least AMLO has said that he trusts the military because they do things and they're loyal and they will respond to, again, who's in office at the time. Yeah. And so I think that's the bigger issue, is kind of like what does happen at the end of AMLO's sexenio. If there's another Morena candidate who becomes president, then maybe there'll be a continuation of his similar policies. But if not, will the Guardia Nacional become what happened to the gendarmerie, or what happened to some of the other previous efforts that Fox and some of the others did? It'll just go back to being integrated back into the military, which, as you mentioned, that's what's happening. The constitutional amendment was to make it official, but everybody knew kind of de facto that the GN was working under Sedena even before that proposal came out.
Yeah. AMLO wants to propose the amendment. I don't think it's been even proposed. They no longer have like the two-thirds majority. They would need to be able to pass a constitutional reform. So it's unclear how much it would happen. But it's worth mentioning that AMLO's reason for this change is so that it continues beyond his term. Because it's, as we've said, like other of these police forces or bodies have disappeared. And so this would be a way to ensure that it continues. But I guess it moves from what it originally was supposed to be to being part of the military.
Well, it's interesting. In fact, one of my colleagues was talking about seeing the Guardia Nacional in their patrol cars. That even some of them still have Policia Federal still on the side of them because they haven't been completely switched over. But at least they're we know that they're performing some of those public safety functions that policing normally would do, like on highways and enforcing traffic regulations and things like that. So that part of it would probably continue in some form, even if it's not the Guardia Nacional. There would be still some type of a public safety function being performed by these institutions in Mexico going forward. The thing with creating this as again an element under Sedena and making it now, just as I mentioned, kind of more just another branch of the military, is that Sedena is interesting. Mexico is different from other countries and even the United States in the sense that they have a Secretary of the Navy and a Secretary of the Defense or the Army as two different cabinet level officials. There's no civilian Minister of Defense who oversees all of Mexico's armed forces. Like we have in the United States. We have a civilian Secretary of Defense who all of the military branches report to, under a president who the Minister of Defense or Secretary of Defense reports to. Mexico has not followed that model, despite efforts by the United States and others to kind of push them in that direction. They've still kept those functions very separate. And so there's a competition between those both for funding, for resources, for personnel. So when the GN gets put under SEDENA, the concern is, will that short, Marina, for example, will the Navy not be getting resources because we see more funding going towards outfitting and equipping the Guardia Nacional under SEDENA. And the same thing goes in terms of looking at pay and benefits and resources. Will we see more of those being transitioned under SEDENA to basically now run the Guardia Nacional officially in terms of how those resources are allocated? So you could see money being moved more towards traditional military functions, not so much on public safety. And so one of the goals of putting it under a civilian secretariat initially was to give it its own budget and give it its own funding sources for, again, personnel, resources, and so on. But everything I've seen so far is that, as you mentioned, it's almost 70% of the GN are military or former military. I mean, they have to resign their commission. They have to basically then rejoin as members of this new force. But it really takes on the same in terms of internal function, organization, the similarity of being another branch of the military. An example would be the Air Force. The Air Force is under the Army. The Air Force is under SEDENA. Even though they have their own uniform, even though they have their own particular missions and functions, they don't serve as a separate branch of the armed forces because they're subordinated to, in this case, the SEDENA or the Minister of Defense in Mexico. Very different from the United States, where the Air Force is its own entity. It comes under a Secretary of the Air Force. They have civilian leadership. Same thing with the Navy, the Army, and so on. But in Mexico, there's this kind of consolidation of. In one conversation I had with a Mexican military officer, he said that the GN doesn't do anything on its own. I mean, it really has everything it does has to be done with SEDENA or with the military. So you don't see it acting independently or having the ability to act independently as its own public safety institution. So
finally. I wanted to ask, how does the National Guard, if at all, impact Mexico's relationship with the United States, and especially in their collaboration to address public security challenges in Mexico?
That's one of the topics that I'm really focusing on this paper in terms of the U.S. role in how we have provided security assistance to Mexico. For years we were providing military support through the Merit Initiative. That's now changed under this new bicentennial framework. So one of the questions I had was, and I've tried to talk with U.S. government officials too on security assistance. Is funding being given directly to the Guardia Nacional for either mill-to-mill or even some of our judicial programs like ICITAP and some of the things that are run through the U.S. Embassy in Mexico City? I haven't really gotten a good response yet on that, other than saying that military-to-military relations between the United States and Mexico have grown exponentially. When I was an exchange student down in Mexico in the 1990s, we were still very suspicious. Mexico was very suspicious of the United States. There were courses in the Escuela Superior de Guerra that I could not attend as a U.S. military officer because they were, we were the threat, right? I mean, they were basically concerned about the United States as a threat. So the mill-to-mill relationship grew exponentially under Merida after Bush was in office, and those have expanded now. The question is, with the Guardia Nacional coming under SEDENA, will that increase those mill-to-mill programs that would directly fund the GN, as opposed to being under a civilian secretariat for public safety and citizens protection? That would have been more conducive to funding coming through like Department of Homeland Security, Department of Justice, or some of the other funding mechanisms that we have in this country to support public safety in Mexico and in other countries as well. And other countries have been able to kind of work through that. For example, my previous research is on North American regional security, U.S., Canada, and Mexico, kind of a trilateral framework. And we know, for example, the Canadian RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, can do more things directly on public safety in Mexico than we can do in the United States through some of the mill-to-mill type programs because of the legal restrictions and other things that don't allow us to fund directly some of those programs through some things like international military education and training, foreign military financing program. Some of the things that have basically funded the Mexican military under Merida are not specifically geared towards public safety roles and missions and more policing type functions. Those would come under different governmental organizations and agencies.
Thank you for answering these questions. I guess we'll have to see how this all unfolds. There's still a lot to see. Will the National Guard continue? what type of activities will it continue to engage in? Will they actually combat these transnational criminal organizations? But thank you so much for
thank you, Enrique.
questions.
That's why I titled the presentation last week "A Work in Progress." I think that's what the GN is right now. But the issue you raised is very concerning about what is it going to be going forward at the end of AMLO's sexennial. What is the broader goal and objective, and really how does that affect civil-military relations in Mexico? And I think that's an issue that should be very concerning.
Richard Kilroy, Associate Professor of Politics at Coastal Carolina University in South Carolina and non-resident scholar for the Center for the United States and Mexico. Again, thank you for your time and for being on the podcast again.
Good. Thank you, Enrique.
That was Richard Kilroy. That is it for this episode. Thank you for listening to the Judy Lee Allen Mexico Center podcast. Thanks to Lisa Guacata, our program manager, and to Tony Payan, the director of the Center for the United States and Mexico at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. Special thanks to Judy Lee Allen for her generous support of the work we do at the center. You can visit our website at bakerinstitute.org/Mexico, where you can find our latest publications. Views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the guests and the host and do not necessarily reflect those of the center. If you have any comments or suggestions, you can email us at usmexicocenter@rice.edu. We would love to hear from you. Mexico Center is available on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, Radio Public, and Spotify. You can subscribe through your favorite podcast app to receive all of our new episodes directly on your phone. I am Enrique Quesada. I will see you next time.